Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, amazing orchids, origins and ecology, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Eleanor Edye. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. Over to you, Eleanor.
Hello, everybody, and thanks, Rob, for the lovely introduction, as always. And we are here today on the Friday before what's probably a long weekend where you are to talk all about orchids. And before I start switching screens here, I just wanted to start you off with what I think is a lovely photo of some beautiful orchids that grow outside my home in my ditch, just to kick us off on orchids around where we live here. So, who am I and what do I do? Well, Rob introduced me. My name's Eleanor. I'm an expedition leader here with Natural Habitat Adventures. And while I get a chance to play with plants pretty often, and I do love plants, and I work with them a lot, I am not an orchid expert. I like them. I think they're really cool. I want to share some cool facts with you. Often I pay most attention to orchids because I'm trying not to smush them when I'm walking around in their habitat looking for other things. But they are beautiful and fascinating. And I think and I hope that we're all going to learn at least a couple of new facts today about orchids, whether or not you're an orchid grower and you love keeping orchids in your home, or you like looking at orchids or other flowers when you're out traveling. There's still always new things to learn, even about stuff that we already love. So you can guess from the title, we're going to be talking about origins and ecology, but I do want to start us off here with answering the question of what an orchid is. What is an orchid? How can you tell when something is an orchid? Well, orchids are kind of the common name for any plant that belongs to a particular family in the plant kingdom. And that family, no surprise here, is called Orchidaceae. It is a really big family with many, many species. It's diverse, it's widespread. There's some images of orchids on the screen right now, and each of these orchids, even though they look quite different, belong to a single genus, the genus that includes the lady slipper orchids. So all of the orchids that you can see on the screen here are considered closely related lady slipper orchids, and as you can see, even within that smaller group, there's still a lot of diversity. They're cosmopolitan plants, meaning that they grow all over the earth and they're found in almost every habitat, excepting polar ice-covered regions and true deserts. It's not quite the largest family of flowering plants, but it is the second largest, coming in just after the sunflower family, the asters or the Asteraceae. But the orchid family contains over 28,000 accepted species. That is a huge, huge number, distributed across 763 genera. So just to give you a comparison, another family that you might be familiar with, the rose family, which gives us lots of familiar plants like the roses, like apples, a lot of very domesticated and familiar plants, hawthorns. That family, which feels like it has a lot of species, which does, has just under 500 species across 91 genera. So compare that against our orchids, which has over 28,000 species, over 763 genera. So big difference there, incredibly diverse. And just the orchids all by themselves, depending on which estimate you're looking at, encompasses somewhere between 6 and 11% of all species of seed plants on Earth. So they feel very rare and they feel very special, and they are, we'll talk about that too, but they are incredibly numerous and incredibly widely distributed. And I also think that one of the cool things about orchids, despite, all the other things we're talking about, is how they are very distinctive. They have a certain orchidness to them. So even if you don't spend any time with plants, even if the only plant you can identify is a dandelion, you could probably still look at an orchid and say, I think that's an orchid, even if you couldn't put your finger on exactly what that is. So in the next 50 minutes or so here, we'll talk through some orchid biology and ecology and talk about their origins and some conservation. And we will spend some time talking about one special orchid that touches all of our lives, which I bet you'll be able to guess which one that is if you spend any time with orchids. So let's just talk a little bit more about what makes them unique from other plants. So this here is not an orchid that we're looking at. It's just a typical, like, it's a plant, and it's a plant diagram to show you what the plant organs are. So in a plant, we have roots, we have shoots, we have leaves, and we have flowers. And those are our main organs in plant development. Our sexual structures, our asexual structures, are structures that absorb lights and produce sugars, our leaves, and then the roots, the ones that absorb nutrients and absorb water for the plant. So our orchids are going to have all these same structures for the most part as well. They're just going to look a little bit different. And as you can imagine, with over 28,000 species, there are so many different varieties of orchids out there, different species of orchids, different ways of looking and growing. But there are some things that we can touch upon that make an orchid very distinct and very unique and different than every single other plant out there. So when we're looking at this kind of orchid diagram, you can still see it's got shoots, it's got leaves, it's got flowers. It kind of gives you all the same pieces, and this is just one way of being an orchid. Other orchids can look different. So let's focus in on the flowers, because it's not just what we pay most attention to, it's what's really you can pinpoint and look at and differentiate an orchid by looking at the flowers. So bear with me here. If you're not a flower person, well, I don't know why you're here, because we're talking about orchids, but we're going to talk about general flower structures for a minute here. So these are the anatomy of a flower, and it's where we're going to start looking at the base pattern and how orchids differentiate from that base pattern. So when we look at the general anatomy of a flower, we start kind of off this base pattern, then any other species or other grouping we look at, we talk about modifications from this base. And we're going to look at the layers here from the bottom up. So the bottom layer that you can see here, well, the pedicel is not quite the bottom layer, it's just what the flower sits on. Most flowers consist of a series of 4 rings of structures. The outermost structure, or the bottom one on this diagram here, is called the sepals. These are often, but not always, green-like color or leaf-like. And this floral organ normally surrounds the flower bud. So it surrounds the petals and everything else on the inside. But it can also be differentiated in different ways, and we'll see that in the orchids as well. From the sepals, those green coverings that cover the flower, you come inwards and you get the petals. And for a lot of us, flowers might start and end here for you because you're looking at the pretty petals. Those are great. We'll talk about those for the orchids as well. And then as we go inwards from the petals, we get into the sexual structures. So the gamete producing structures, both the male and the female ones. So our next whorl in is the male, or the pollen producing structures. Collectively, these are called the stamens, and they're made up of both an anther and a filament. So the anther is a little blobby bit on the end where the pollen's produced, and the filament's just what holds it up in the air so it comes in contact or either with the air or with animals that come in to pollinate it. The middle and most inside ring of our flower here is the female structures. And the female structures at the base is the ovary, where the eggs are produced. And within the ovary, that's actually what becomes the fruit as well. So once those ovaries, those eggs are pollinated, they will develop into the seeds, and the ovary develops into the fruit. The other bits above that, the style and the stigma is the sticky bit that collects the pollen. The style is just what holds it up further out so that it can more easily make contact with pollen. And collectively, these female structures are called pistils, but I'll probably just refer to these as male and female structures as we go through. So, okay, there's our basic flower. It's got these different rings. It's got our sepals, our petals, our male bits, and our female bits, all differentiated like this. And if you picture, for example, a tulip in your mind, for the most part, this is exactly what this looks like. You've got the yellow bits with the pollen, then you've got the middle, the pistil, the female bits that collects the pollen, and you can picture that in your mind pretty well. Let's look at orchids, and we're going to start here by looking at a quote-unquote simple orchid. This is a type of orchid called a sun orchid, and when you look at it, it doesn't look that different than, for example, the tulip that I just mentioned. It's got modified sepals, so just like in tulips, the sepals here in the sun orchid are also colored, so they look like petals. And if you're a plant, and if we were to assign plants reasons for doing things, you might do this as a plant because having brighter, more attractive, larger flowers might bring in more pollinators to you. So that could be a reason why we see colored sepals in both tulips and in the sun orchid, for example. But as we look here at that middle structure, you might look and say, hang on, I'm not seeing all those layers that you talked about, Eleanor. What's going on here? Well, here is the structure that exists in the orchids, in pretty well all the orchids in one way or another, that differentiates it from other flowering plants. And this is the central column that exists inside the middle of the orchid. And it's where the male and female bits have been brought together to live and grow on a single structure with some very interesting adaptations so you don't get the pollen accidentally fertilizing that same flower, because sometimes there are reasons why flowers might want to self-fertilize, but often what they're trying to do is separate those structures so that they're never going to self-pollinate. So this structure, like I said, this is a kind of a simple orchid, but it still has that very distinct column on the inside. If we go to a more typical orchid structure, so look here, this one is called a moth orchid or a phalaenopsis. If you grow orchids in your home or anybody's ever gifted you an orchid, especially if they bought it from Home Depot or somewhere like that, that doesn't really sell a lot of orchids, this is probably at least the genus of orchid that somebody gifted you or that you bought for yourself as a moth orchid. So this one shows us a more typical orchid floral pattern, but if we look at it, it's got the same structures, right? It's got the three sepals, sepal, 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 and then it's got petals sitting above that. But here we're looking at a petal, and then a modified petal called a lip. And in most of our orchids here, that lip is a landing location for their pollinator of choice. And that lip and that column are well designed together to match with one or more pollinator species. So this is our orchid floral structure. When we're looking at orchids, you're never going to see those distinct, separate sexual structures like we do in other plants. You are going to see that central column where things have been brought together to exist on that single stalk. And without getting all right up in the face of these orchids, it's hard to really get a sense of what that looks like. You know, if you're watching this on a small screen right now, this might be difficult to see, and I apologize for this, but I wanted to give a sense of what this looks like all put together. So you're looking at a section here on the left-hand side of that floral structure, and you can see that column as it's come together here, containing all of the sexual structures. So typically how this works is that column is what sits in the middle. You've got the lip at the bottom for your pollinator to land on. Your male structure is going to be the frontmost part on that flower. So it's going to be the thing that's easiest for those insects or other pollinators to come in contact with. And then the female structure sits on that column just a little bit further back in a way that they don't make contact with each other. There's sometimes in some species actually a membrane that fully separates them, so it's impossible for the pollen and the stigma to actually make contact with each other. And in other species, it's just a geographical separation where they're just a little bit further apart and they're not going to touch. If you have an orchid in front of you, or if you get a chance to look at one later, look for these structures. Look for the 3 sepals on the outside, then the 3 petals, probably one of which is going to be differentiated into that special landing platform, that lip. Okay, and how are these structures pollinated? I like watching pollination. I have a garden, I have flowers. I like watching happy bees flying around carrying little bits of pollen with them. So this image that you can see here is it's a bumblebee wearing its little saddlebags of pollen. And perhaps you've seen this in your own garden. You'll see whether it's honeybees or bumblebees or some of our other pollinator species as well, they'll fly around and it looks like they have little saddlebags or little knee pads on. And this very adorable sight is a bee that's carrying harvested pollen in its built-in pollen baskets, actually part of the tibia on its back legs there, that it will take back to its nest or back to its hive to use as food. So that's a typical way that we see pollination happening on things like roses and on all of your other garden plants, whether it's your tomatoes, whether it's your pea plants, whether it's your roses. This is usually what our bees look like in other pollinator species as they're moving around that way. But when a pollinator pollinates an orchid, they look quite a bit different. And this next image is going to be a close-up photo of a bee, so don't be surprised by it here. And it looks, like I said, very different. You can see those little yellow structures coming out of the head of that bee there. If you're wondering what they are, it can look like antennae. It can look like perhaps this insect has been infected with a fungus, perhaps. No, in this case, we're actually looking at an insect that is being used as a pollinator species by either an orchid or potentially a milkweed. That's the other type of plant that uses this pollination strategy. And instead of using dry, powdery pollen that can be scraped off and carried by a bee or carried in the wind, they make these hard structures called pollinia. And those pollinia are designed to come off as a unit and actually stick themselves onto the face of whatever animal has shoved itself into that orchid's flower looking for a meal. Now, as I mentioned, it's not the only, orchids are not the only type of plant that use pollinia. Milkweed do as well. Milkweed make a lot of nectar. They draw insects in for a meal, and while the insects are rooting around for a meal, they have these pollinia that stick on them. In orchids, though, it's a different story, and it's not usually based on a food reward as to what's drawing these animals in. So let's look at our next picture here. This one is showing us pollinia on an orchid, and it's showing the pollinia of a particular species called a bumblebee orchid. And remember our floral structure, you can see those purple sepals that are framing our flower, and that modified petal is very modified here. As you can see, it almost looks reminiscent of a bumblebee itself. But can you see those, what look like little yellow antennae curving down from that central column? Those are the pollinia of that species hanging down. So this species, our bumblebee orchid here, it's pollinated almost always by a single species of bee called a type of solitary bee that's found in a certain part of this plant's range. And when these bees come into this orchid, they're not looking for food. They're not looking for pollen or nectar to collect and take back to their hive or take back to their nest to keep themselves over the winter. They are coming in because they smell this flower and they see this flower, and those male bees who are out harvesting food go, fuck, never mind the food. Look at this beautiful female bee over here. So this mimicry that's being done of the female bee of that species isn't just the looks, it's also the chemicals that are produced within the orchid. And it's called a chemosensory mimicry. So both the chemistry and the sensations that that male bee gets from that flower are telling it that that is a female bee. So they come in and they attempt copulation with this flower, thinking it's another bee. And in the process, and probably in the confusion, those pollinia, those ones that are hanging down there, will stick on the head of that bee. And when that bee becomes frustrated and leaves that flower and tries his luck at another flower, he will be carrying those pollinia on his head. And as he comes in to attempt copulation with the next flower, will bring those pollinia in contact with the female parts on that next orchid. Very, very involved process from getting pollen from one place to another. Now, as an aside, this particular species can self-pollinate as well. So we do find this in some orchids that they can self-pollinate, but they are designed, in this case, for this one particular species of bee. Kind of cool. Here's another example of pseudocopulation. This is actually another plant in the same genus. So this is Orchids. And this one here is called the mirror orchid, whereas the last one was the bumblebee orchid. You can see, looking at the image on the right-hand side there, that it looks different than the last orchid we were looking at, but it still looks very insect-like. So in this case, the pollinator of choice is a type of wasp. And this orchid is once again mimicking both the look and the chemistry of a female wasp of the same species. So this wasp, the exact same thing is going to happen to him, because we're only talking about the males doing this pollination, will come in, attempt pollination with this species of flower, get those pollinia stuck to his head, and then attempting on the next plant, will then transfer that pollen to the next orchid of the same species. So if you're wondering how well this works, well, the answer is sort of well, not always well. Plants like this that are highly, highly, highly specialized to not just bees or wasps or moths, but to one single species of pollinator or to a single small group of pollinators, tend to receive fewer visits. Makes sense, right? There's just fewer options out there. If you're only looking to attract a single species of wasp and no other wasp is the right shape or chemistry to find you and interact with you, you're not going to have as many visits to your flowers, and a lot of those pollinia are going to never make their way onto a wasp space. But when you do have interaction, it is very, very successful. So while not every flower might get a wasp visiting it, if you get a wasp visiting you, you're a flower and a wasp visits you and your pollinia go onto its head, you can be 100% sure that that wasp is going to go ahead and carry that pollinia to another species of you, or another plant of the same species. So it is very valuable in terms of making sure that your pollen's going to the right place, even if you don't get visited as often by any pollinator. Now, are wasps and bees the only insects that visit orchids? No. Unfortunately, for those of us who live in mosquito territory, we always have to give credit to the mosquitoes. They do an awful lot of pollination, even though it feels like they're far too busy biting us to be busy pollinating us, pollinating the flowers. This is an example of one of those interactions. This is a blunt leaf orchid. It's found in both in the Pacific Northwest of the US as well as through areas of Canada. It's a very small green flower. It's not visited by a lot of other pollinators, but it will bloom at the exact same time that these mosquitoes, and these are particularly known as the snow pool mosquito. They breed in recently melted snow pools. These flowers will open exactly when the emergence happens for the mosquitoes and when they're hatching. And in areas where the plants are found further north and that snow melt happens later, the plants bloom later so that they can time themselves for the arrival of these mosquitoes. And in fact, studies have shown that one of the chemicals that calls to these mosquitoes is the same smell that humans emit through their skin that helps mosquitoes find us. So they have developed quite the elaborate chemistry to interact with their target pollinator species. Now, if orchids are starting to feel a little bit overwhelming, you're not alone and you are in good company. There are stories of people coming across new orchids and new orchids new to science when they were traveling, especially back in the Victorian times, for example. Darwin himself was made fun of for quite a while by the naturalists of his day when he documented this orchid. Not only does this orchid look kind of odd, it's odd in the orchid world for a couple of reasons. A small reason is that it has separate male and female flowers, like on actually different plants. This is not common in the orchid world. This plant, by the way, is called sac-shaped catasetum. It's a tropical South American species. But what makes this orchid so amazing besides its looks is that it has a pollen sac, its pollinia, that doesn't just stick on the head of an animal, it actually launches from the flower. And that pollen sac can launch up to 8 feet when it is triggered by an insect touching the correct part of the flower to launch that pollen sac. Talk about a little bit of overboard, but orchids are all about going overboard, is I think what we can say here. Here's another example of crazy plant world things that happen and how much specialization has happened within the orchids. This is a bucket orchid. Coryanthes is the genus name. And bucket orchids are, I would call, one of the more extreme examples of kind of coevolution between the plant and its target pollinator species. So it's evolved along with a species of orchid bee. And both the orchid and the orchid bee are 100% dependent on each other for reproduction. So this plant produces the orchid flower here. It's called a bucket orchid. It looks like a bucket, and it actually secretes a fluid into that flower lip, into the little bucket, where the male orchid bees are going to come visit. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, this flower doesn't look like a female bee. Why are they visiting it? It's not pseudocopulation in this case. The male bees are visiting this flower not because it looks like a female bee, but because they are going to collect for themselves scented wax produced by this plant that make the male bees, one can only imagine, irresistible to female bees. And they'll actually store it up inside pouches on their hind legs, and they'll use it in the courtship dances in order to attract their females. But in the course of collecting this waxy scented substance, they fall into the bucket and they take a while to get out. And it actually takes, on average, about 45 minutes for that poor bee who is collecting his perfume and his cologne to climb out of this orchid. And of course, as you can imagine, in the process of this, he's picking up pollinia on his head. And then when he goes to his next flower to collect more of this beautiful scent, he is going to transfer that pollinia to the next orchid flower. So again, orchids are all about excess, is what it feels like, and being incredibly specialized. Now, what happens after pollination happens? There's some other cool things that happen in our orchid ecology after pollination. So we talked about males and females coming together, seeds grow, fruit grows. And orchids are just the same. They grow seeds, they grow fruit. But within the fruit, we have not what I'd call regular seeds. They have orchid seeds, and orchid seeds have some very particular evolutionary traits to them. They are, firstly, very, very, very tiny and very, very, very numerous. So in a single orchid seed pod, the fruit, there might be up to 1,500 seeds inside a single fruit, actually up to 3 million seeds in a single seed pod. These seeds, when we're looking at this image here, that kind of dusty substance that you can see on the plate, these are the sizes of the seeds that we're talking about. They are incredibly tiny, fractions of a millimeter, maybe up to a millimeter long for the really, really big ones. And this is them under magnification here, and you can see they don't look like what I would consider normal seeds, right? There's no real seed coat. There's obviously not a lot of resources there to support that seed while it's growing. And again, orchids have become incredibly specialized to not need these things. To take a step back and compare it to a quote unquote normal seed, normally seeds come as a little package, right? They have a seed coat that protects the baby inside. And they don't just have that protection for the baby inside, they also have a lot of food for that baby. So that's something called an endosperm. It's a starchy substance that's produced inside the seeds of these plants that provides food and carbohydrates for that plant as it is growing out of the seed. Well, how is an orchid supposed to do that when it is the size? Here's our size comparison again here. Here's our orchid seeds on the left. Here's some wheat seeds on the right. Which one's going to be more successful at growing here? And what's a poor orchid supposed to do? Well, unlike the wheats, and unlike most of our seeds that are set up to be put in the ground, watered, and let go because they have sent themselves a little complete package there to care for that seed, orchids call upon some help. And they call upon fungi. So we're often used to thinking of fungi as problems in the garden, right? If you have a fungus attacking your plants, that's usually a problem for your plants. But it almost, like, it really does go the other way with orchids. Orchids almost attack the local fungi. So while fungi, we get a lot of fungal associations in plants. A lot of times when they're called mycorrhizal fungi, they're small, they grow into the plant, and they transfer nitrogen and phosphorus to plants, and they receive carbohydrates in exchange. In the case of orchids, at the time when they are growing and developing from a seed, that fungus is actually providing all nutrients and all energy to the plant. And every orchid, at least in the wild, is dependent on fungus for its germination and growth. And in fact, you could consider that orchid is actually parasitizing that fungus because it's giving nothing back to that fungus in exchange. So that's an orchid seed growing there. And as that orchid grows, some orchids, which I'll talk about in a second, continue to parasitize the fungus. But even at maturity, a lot of orchids will have very, very strong fungal associations. And if you've ever looked at an orchid, especially orchids that have what we call aerial roots, so roots that grow into the air, that's what this white structure is that you can see in the background. It's a root growing out of a pot. They don't look like normal roots, right? If you've ever pulled out a carrot, the carrot's a root, right? It's covered in lots of little tiny hairs. It's covered in lots of smaller roots as well to increase the surface area of that root to be better able to absorb water and other nutrients. This root does not look very effective at doing that, correct? So it has to use other associations. This coating on an aerial root of this orchid includes within it these balls of fungal hyphae that are being used to increase the surface area of that root, similarly to how all of those little root hairs increase the surface area of your carrots. And little pointed trivia here, those little fungal balls within those aerial roots are called pelotons, just like the bicycle. So you can have, everybody can have a peloton in their house for Christmas if you just go out and get an orchid. But all of these orchids here, they all parasitize the fungus when they are young and when they're embryos. And in adulthood, they will either continue on being in a very close association with their fungus, or they may, in fact, continue to parasitize it. And those fungal partners are very, very different depending where our orchids are growing. They are going to form associations with fungal partners in their environment. So, you know, an orchid that's native to the mountains of Mexico is going to have fungal partners that are also native to the mountains of Mexico, and so on. But almost all of those partners are part of the group Basidiomycetes. So the guild mushrooms are the fungal partners for most of our orchids here. So some examples of what they can look like there. And at adulthood, some of our orchids do continue to be fully parasitic on those fungi. A couple examples of these. This is an orchid called either potato orchid or cinnamon bells, depending how fancy you want to sound, I guess. It's also called the pot-bellied orchid. It's found in Australia as well as in New Zealand. It is a leafless terrestrial orchid that is saprophytic, meaning that it feeds on dead matter. But in fact, it's not really feeding directly on dead matter. It's feeding on the fungus that is decomposing the dead material around it and is parasitizing that fungus. That fungus, in this case, is not getting anything in return from that orchid. There are other saprophytic orchids as well. In fact, it's quite a common strategy for orchids to be saprophytic and to grow on other things and to require those fungal partners to give more than they are getting. One that we find in North America here is coralroot. This one is striped coralroot. It's widespread across a lot of Canada as well as the northern US and even into Mexico. Found most often in pine and coniferous forests. And it again gets all of its nutrients and all of its carbohydrates straight from the fungus as it parasitizes that fungus. So you can see here that coral root, it's got stalk, it's got flowers, it has kind of a leaf base wrapped around the stem there, but there is no green in either one of the plants that we just looked at because they don't produce chlorophyll, because they don't produce their own sugar. They are feeding off dead material fed to them by their fungus. Now, if you might be thinking to yourself, well, orchids sound incredibly, diverse, sure, but do they give back? What part do they have in the larger ecosystem? They're tricking pollinators. Some of them don't even give back anything in terms of a reward to their pollinators. Some of them don't even photosynthesize. What kind of plant are you if you don't even do those things? Well, they are still in the larger food web. There are many things out there that do eat orchids. In North America, the white-tailed deer and the mule deer are, our main predators of orchids. They quite like the flower stalks and they like to eat the orchids probably before seed is set. So they like it when it's nice and fresh. But really, any small, usually omnivorous species will eat orchids. So this could be possums, monkeys, rodents. Will feed on nectar, pollen, and the whole orchid itself as well. And even some bats will also eat orchids. So it's not like they're out there just doing their own thing. They do have things that will come and eat them as well. Now let's talk about orchid evolution, and I'll try to kind of bring in the interesting parts to this because we talked about how diverse this plant family is and how many species there are and how many different ways there are of being an orchid. And it's been difficult to say in the past about how old a group the orchids are because plant remains, especially soft plants, just don't fossilize really well. So we have to go off of things like molecular clocks and looking at rates of mutation in plants to kind of track back how long they are likely to exist. But we do have some fossil evidence of how old orchids definitely are. This is an extinct bee that was recovered from amber, estimated 15 to 20 million year old amber that contains a very unambiguous fossil. Everybody is 100% sure this is what we're looking at, of an orchid pollinia on its back. So this tells us that 20 million years ago, orchids were well developed and they were already having those exclusive relationships with their pollinators like we see today. Using the ways of tracking things back and the estimations that we can use, we do estimate that orchids are a very old group of plants, that they've been around likely since the dinosaurs. But they've been radiating, so they become much more diverse in the time since around 65 to 70 million years ago, even though as a group, they've probably been around over 100 million years. So that is fairly ancient as far as the flowering plants go. They've gone through some interesting evolutionary innovations. It looks like I'm not a molecular biologist, thank goodness. I would not want to be, but I'm grateful that they exist because it gives us interesting things like this to talk about. We see at least two distinct events that have happened in the orchid evolutionary history where they have gone through what's called a whole genome duplication. So imagine if you took your whole genome, you took all of your chromosomes and you just doubled it, and then you kept all those genes. And they went through this process at least twice. And to make it as simple as I can, when you have a lot of genes to work with, you have a lot of room for evolution to work fast and hard because you have a lot of potential things to be pulling from as you grow and develop and evolve into new species. And these events have given us a lot of different adaptations in the orchid world. And some of the things that have made them go through these really quick radiations are significant innovations, like the evolution of pollinia, like that pollen structure that comes off and goes with an animal. We said it's only happened in the orchids and the milkweed. That's an incredibly important evolutionary advantage. The fact that they can grow on other plants, a particular type of photosynthesis that they do that makes them less needy for water. The fact that they do pollination via bees or by butterflies as well means that they're using the insects that are very common and able to move around by flying in the habitats that they've used. To seek pollination, when they have evolved to be able to mimic their pollinator. All of these things have increased the amount of diversity that is in the orchid group. And we find this orchid diversity through the world. I said that it was a group that has colonized almost every surface on the planet. But we find in a whole world survey of the Orchidaceae, this comes from a fairly recent study, the hot spots for richness are primarily in the tropics. No surprise there. Especially in New Guinea is one of the hot spots for orchid richness, as well as new evolution. We know from the same study that looked at the whole of the orchid group as much as they could. They estimated they looked at 90% of those almost 28,000 species. They found that of all the orchids, most were epiphytes, meaning that they grew on other plants or on other structures that elevated them off the floor. Most of them are in the tropics, most of them are in lowlands, and most are pollinated by ants, bees, or wasps. And this study also showed us that we still don't know a lot about orchids. No surprise here, right? With that many species, it's hard to conserve things that you don't know a lot about or study a lot about. 30,000 species where no single species is incredibly common and widely distributed means that a lot of these species have not been assessed for protection status. So we don't even know which of these species need protection. Some countries around the world are doing a really good job on protecting orchids. In many areas, or like including here, this WWF poster for India and their protected orchids. Many of them are legally protected, but this is not the case everywhere, and there are still species that we barely even know about. Despite the fact that we, as a whole, humans love orchids. People love orchids. There are orchid clubs, there are orchid fairs. We have 28,000 species of orchids, but since the introduction of species into cultivation, we as humans, the horticulturalists, have produced more than 100,000 hybrids and cultivars of orchids. So we're making more and prettier ones and ones that do what we want them to. And there's something really special about them. I do want to finish up my next few minutes here by talking about an orchid that's really special to probably a lot of us here. And that is the vanilla orchid. And I do want to take a few minutes to talk about it because vanilla, well, I've been doing a lot of baking personally, so I've been reaching for my bottle of vanilla quite often. And I think about how, as I'm reaching for my vanilla and thinking about what flavors I'm blending in the cookies, how funny it is that vanilla has become this basic household spice, and maybe not spice, but flavor that we use without thinking about it. And I have, in fact, been guilty of teasing one of my children because he only likes vanilla ice cream. And how boring is it to only like vanilla ice cream? Well, how boring is it that you are getting your flavoring from an exotic orchid, from the fruit of this rare tropical plant where it only blooms for a single day? It sets fruit, less than one time in 100. It's a flavor that's been so difficult to obtain in the past and so exotic that we literally used to extract vanilla-like flavoring and vanilla enhancer from beaver anal gland scents as a replacement because getting orchids was too difficult. How funny that we think of vanilla as this baseline flavor now and we throw it into things without thinking about it. Just not to ignore the fact that we're talking about castoreum, because that's what we're talking about here. Castoreum is very rarely used in the food product industry these days, but it is still an approved food additive. Castoreum was primarily used as a food and flavor enhancer, particularly of vanilla flavor when vanilla was too difficult and too expensive to get. You might use, as somebody in the 1700s or even into the 1800s, you might use castoreum from your locally harvested beaver anal glands to supplement the flavors or smells of vanilla. But don't worry, it's not in your vanilla ice cream today. Instead, we are blessed in our times to be able to have relatively cheap and relatively accessible vanilla plants and true vanilla to us. Vanilla is a genus of orchid. It's the vanilla orchid genus. It contains around 110 species within that orchid family, of which we, as for our cultivation uses, we only use about one. I say about one species because there's a couple of other cultivars in there as well. About one species, the flat leaf vanilla, for our flavor use. And it's the one from which basically all commercial vanilla flavoring is derived. It's delicious. I love it. It's a very unassuming plant when you look at it. This is flat leaf vanilla growing in somebody's pot here. And that's what it looks like when it's not flowering, which is the majority of the year. In a vanilla plantation, this is what it looks like. And it's not that they're those tall plants, it's that vanilla is by its nature an epiphyte, meaning it's growing on something else. In this case, it's been planted to grow on a local tree species so it can wrap its way up there. So it does grow as that evergreen vine. Beautiful there now. And here are some more flowers. So the flowers come as a cluster, thankfully. We have more than one flower per plant. They come as usually 12 to 20 buds together. They're beautiful. They're kind of pale yellow. They have very little scent to them. And these flowers require pollination to set fruit. They are really not very well able to self-pollinate. In the absence of a pollinator, these blooms will simply drop off without having set fruit. And these flowers only open for about 6 hours at a time. If you don't pollinate them within that 6 hours, they will drop off, and there goes your investment in your vanilla plants. So in the wild, even with access to a pollinating species, there's only around a 1% chance that any individual flower would be pollinated. So wild harvested vanilla, what we would have in the past, for example, was incredibly rare and incredibly expensive, even if it's not a rare plant by itself. And we can thank our commercial use of vanilla really down to one person, who is a man named Edmund Albius, who is living and working on Reunion Island, or at the time it was known as Ile Bourbon, an island close to Madagascar. And at that time, there was a lot of effort to duplicate the success that vanilla had had in Mexico, where the natural pollinator species of vanilla existed, because the vanilla orchid is native to Mexico. If you want to grow it elsewhere, It turned out after they went and planted all of these vanilla vines around the world and in different colonies, that there were no pollinators that could do the job. And it was, in fact, this man here who was at the time 12 years old, living and working on a vanilla plantation, who innovated the way to very quickly and very easily hand pollinate vanilla. And if you are interested in the history of vanilla, I highly advise a couple of talks that have happened recently, one of which was a great one produced by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, available online, and it's on the Ideas program, and it's called The Enslaved Teen Who Cracked Vanilla's Secret, because it really was a secret, and it really is an interesting story. And it is especially interesting that we are able to sit and talk about this today, because this was not hidden. This Edmund Albius, it was known that he was the one who did this innovation, and he was the one to go around to all the other plantations in the area and teach that same technique to give us the vanilla plantations and the vanilla cultivation that we're able to use today. But when all is said and done and that hand pollination has happened, and it can be done very quickly with a toothpick or with your hand or with a needle, but it just needs to happen within that 6-hour window, you will get these vanilla pods growing. They are harvested green, then left to cure and dry, and then placed into an alcohol so that that flavor can come out and become your vanilla flavoring. Like I said, there are a variety of vanilla types around the world, but we tend to, the vanilla bean, not that it's a bean, but the vanilla orchid is native to Mexico. But most of what's grown for consumption by humans today is grown in and around Madagascar. If you're wondering what relation artificial vanilla extract has to vanilla, not much. It does get you vanillin. You probably would agree it doesn't taste the same. About 15% of that production of artificial vanilla extract comes from pulp and paper waste, and about 85% of it is synthesized from petrochemical precursors. So it's not nearly as exotic as your orchid giving you the flavoring for your ice cream. I sure enjoy the fact that vanilla is accessible to us today, and I hope that you have learned something about orchids, and that you can maybe go appreciate some holiday baking that contains vanilla after we're done here today. So I'm going to hand it back over to Rob here for any questions, which I will attempt to answer to my best extent.
All right, thank you, Eleanor. Now, before we start in with the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. All right, let's get to some of these questions. So could you give us an example of orchid pollination by mimicry?
So an example of orchid pollination by mimicry would be some of the examples that we kind of touched on earlier. And that mimicry can take several different types, right? I'll just circle us back through, going all the way back. So here's some mimicry, and there's some more mimicry. Mimicry in orchids usually takes more than one shape or scent. In fact, it usually takes a shape and a scent. So in this one here, like our bumblebee orchid, the mimicry is both the sensory mimicry, because as you can see, looking at that orchid, it's really fantastic. Like, it's got fuzz on it, just like a bumblebee does. It actually has little fake bumblebee legs so that during copulation, the bee can hold on to what he thinks is a female bee, just like he would in a normal copulation position. So we have that physical sensory mimicry, but we also have the chemical mimicry. So as we were talking about with some of these flowers, in this case of the bumblebee orchid, we have a species that has evolved to produce the same chemical scent as a female bumblebee of that solitary bee species. But it's not the only way that orchids will chemically mimic something desirable. for example, with that mosquito pollinated species we talked about, obviously that doesn't look like a human's arm. It's not like the mosquito is going in going, oh boy, that looks like a delicious human or a delicious moose that I'm going to take a bite out of. But it is scented like a human arm or like human skin would be to draw in those mosquitoes in a chemical mimicry way. So we can have a lot of different types of mimicry, but I don't know of any case where an orchid is um, only using physical mimicry. There is almost always, at least to my knowledge, it always includes chemical mimicry as well. Because don't forget, these orchids, they're putting kind of all of their eggs in a single basket here. For them to pollinate another plant of the same species, they need their pollinator, and no other pollinator will do. So it is to their best interest to go all out on everything they can do, whether it's that physical and or chemical mimicry, to really have their best chance of drawing in their preferred pollinator species. Because with this orchid, for example, this blunt-leaved orchid here, it's not that other species like black flies or other species of mosquitoes don't visit this plant, because they're also drawn in by the scent of human skin, but they are not the right shape to pollinate this flower. So they may come in, they might go, uh-oh, not a human, and fly away again. And they haven't been able to interact with that flower to collect that pollinia because they're not the right shape or the right size. So one of these really exciting innovations that orchids have done is going all out into that mimicry, both of the physical and the chemical ways of attracting their preferred pollinator.
So when a pollinia is taken from another orchid, where is it deposited?
So there's our lovely mosquito there. Doesn't he look pretty with his little pollinia on his head? It is ideally going to go, and that mosquito hopefully is going to go to an adjacent plant, and where that pollinia placement happens reflects where that animal needs to go on the flower to make contact. So if you recall that picture I showed of the insect in amber, that pollinia was actually placed on that bee's back. So for the end goal is for that chunk of pollen to make contact with the pollen accepting organ, so the female bits of another flower, but it has to be in the exact right position for that to happen. And in this case with this mosquito, when that mosquito goes into that flower looking for the scent of a human, those pollinia are going to be, just by virtue of being placed there by another flower, they're going to be in the exact right position to make contact with the pollen accepting substrate on the next plant. Just like with our bee who had the pollinia on its back, that will tell you about where it's going to be making contact and how it's going to interact with the next orchid it comes to. So it's really like, it's incredibly well designed. And if, for example, that mosquito that we're looking at right now had been a different species, say a different species called in because it smelled something good, it crawled in and it was half the size of this mosquito, let's just say. If the pollinia landed on that mosquito instead, very likely it wouldn't be then in the correct position when it visits the next flower. And this is why, because you've got kind of a lock and a key here, and the key's got to be, if your key's trying to go into a lock, you can't have the key up here, even if you've got the right hand holding it, you can't have the key down here. It's got to fit exactly in. And this is what these orchids are trying to do with their pollination strategies, is making sure that the right hand has the key and that the hand is the one that's going to line up perfectly with the next lock or the next flower in this case.
So for those of us who have difficulty keeping orchids alive, is it possible to purchase the correct type of fungus to apply occasionally to our houseplant orchids?
Right, that's a great question, and I would join in with you because orchids are known to be quite temperamental, aren't they? There's a reason that we call them hothouse orchids and difficult to grow for a reason. When it comes to germinating your orchid, so you say you're starting from seed, what most places do now is actually not inoculate with fungus. They will actually start their orchid seeds off in a nutrient slurry so that those seeds are able to take nutrients from the slurry around them without the intermediary of a fungus. And the main reason for that is because it makes everybody's lives a little bit easier. Because when we're talking about thousands upon thousands and thousands of orchid species, in a lot of cases, we're not even sure what their preferred fungal partner is. And studies have been done, and there's a lot of cases where we do know, but really the only way to find out is to go out into the wild where orchids grow, collect some samples, take samples of the fungus growing within the orchid in its native habitat, and figure out based on the DNA what its partner is. And then maybe if you're lucky, collect some of that partner, develop it into an inoculum of some kind. This is very, very expensive and difficult. So what most orchid growers have gone with for pretty well all types of production for home use and for hothouses is this sterile technique where they are in fact sterilizing seeds and sterilizing the medium and making it so that you have available nutrients to the seeds to grow, even in the absence of a fungus providing them. So that's the long answer about why you're not going to find fungal inoculae for your plants in the store, because each species has a different fungus that it's going to be interacting with, and that's very nearly impossible to manage.
So, does the vanilla scent used in cosmetics, for example, does that come from the extract as well?
In some cases, it does. It depends on what your source is and what they've chosen to do. Um, you know, theoretically, possibly it might come from beaver anal glands. That's also um, approved approved to be listed as a natural source product when you look at it. So some of those notes might come from natural vanilla, or it might come from artificial ingredients, depending on what that perfume or other manufacturer has chosen to use. Fortunately, like I consider ourselves so lucky to live in a day where we have readily accessible vanilla. And even though buying a vanilla pod is fairly expensive, it produces a lot of flavor in a single pod, and it's still relatively affordable compared to what it would have been 200 years ago. So in a lot of cases, natural vanilla scent is coming from vanilla itself.
So, do female honeybees also collect pollen from orchids?
So honeybees will very much depend on the species in question. There are some species of bees where it really is just the males out there collecting pollen and collecting nectar. But there are other species, especially the solitary bees or the bumblebees, where both sexes are out there working because they are overwintering in individually, for example. So a very, very species dependent.
All right. Well, thank you for that. Unfortunately, that's going to be the last question that we do have for today. So I'm going to hand it back to you for any closing comments you have.
Thanks everybody for swinging by today. I hope your evening brings you some vanilla ice cream or vanilla cookies, and that you have a fantastic weekend. Thanks so much for joining.
Eleanor, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. Now, if you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us next Wednesday for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.